The alarm didn't go off. That was the first thing. Then the coffee maker died mid-brew, leaving you with half a cup and a full day ahead. You grabbed your keys, already 10 minutes behind, and hit traffic that shouldn't exist at this hour. The meeting you prepared for all week started without you. Your carefully rehearsed points, the slides you stayed up perfecting, the promotion you could almost taste, someone else presented. Someone else got noticed. By lunch, your phone buzzed with a text that unraveled something you thought was solid. By evening, you were staring at the ceiling, that familiar tightness spreading across your chest, wondering why nothing ever goes according to plan. That feeling sitting with you right now? It's been felt by every person who's ever tried to build something, love someone, or simply make it through a day with some dignity intact. We're all fighting the same invisible battle against reality itself, expecting one thing, colliding with another. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha discovered something about this collision. Something so simple, it sounds almost too easy. Yet the people who truly understand it have found a kind of peace that doesn't depend on everything going right. For the next few hours, we're going to explore that discovery together. If it feels right, grab a cozy blanket, settle somewhere quiet, and let this be a moment of global connection. You can rest here, drift if you need to, return when you're ready. Let's begin where the teaching always begins. With suffering, we can actually touch. Picture this. You're driving home after a long day, finally heading toward rest, toward your couch, toward that moment when you can just stop. You turn onto the street that leads to the highway, and there it is, the railroad crossing. The lights start flashing, the bells start ringing. The black and white striped arm descends across the road, and you press the brake. Then you see it. The train. Not a quick passenger train that'll pass in 30 seconds. A freight train. One of those impossibly long cargo trains that seems to stretch all the way back to another state. Car after car after car. Each one identical. Each one another few seconds of your life, ticking away. A car pulls up behind you, then another. You're all stuck now. A little community of strangers bound together by this massive train that doesn't care about any of your plans. 5 seconds pass. 10. 15. And then you hear it. The third car back starts honking. Long, aggressive blasts of the horn, as if the sound waves might somehow reach the conductor 2 kilometers down the track and convince him to stop, reverse, apologize for the inconvenience. It's absurd, isn't it? Honking at a freight train. But before we judge that person too harshly, let's be honest. We've all done some version of this. We've sent the angry text that won't change anything. We've replayed the argument in our heads for the 100th time, rewriting history with better comebacks. We've gripped the steering wheel until our knuckles turned white, as if our frustration might magically dissolve the traffic ahead. We've refreshed our email obsessively, willing the response we want to appear. We've lain awake constructing elaborate speeches we'll never give, solving problems that may never arise. preparing for futures that exist only in our anxious imagination. We honk at freight trains every single day. And here's the question worth sitting with. Why? What makes an intelligent, rational person lean on a horn in front of an unstoppable train? What makes us yell at a computer screen, snap at someone we love, or lie awake at 3 a.m, replaying a conversation we can't change? The answer is simpler than you might think. We do it because we haven't surrendered. We haven't accepted that this moment, exactly as it is the only moment we actually have. Let's back up for a second. Let's talk about expectations. Expectations aren't the enemy. We need them to function. You expected gravity to work this morning when you got out of bed, and that expectation served you well. You expected your door to open, your car to start, language to carry meaning from one person to another. Expectations help us navigate reality. You're listening to this right now because you have some expectation that spending these hours might offer something valuable. That's a healthy expectation. It brought you here. It opened you to learning. So expectations themselves aren't the problem. The problem is what happens when they become rigid, when they calcify into demands, when they transform from flexible preferences into ironclad requirements for your happiness. Think about your day today. Before it even started, you had a plan. Maybe not a detailed schedule, but a general sense of how things should unfold. You'd wake at a certain time, feel a certain way, accomplish certain things. You'd have certain conversations, receive certain responses, experience certain outcomes. And woven into that plan, often invisibly, was an assumption. The assumption that if these things happened in this way, you'd be okay. You'd be happy, or at least content. You'd feel some sense of accomplishment, some sense of worth. But then reality showed up. And reality, as it tends to do, had its own plans. The meeting went differently than you expected. The person you needed to talk to wasn't available. Your body felt tired when you wanted it to feel energized. The weather didn't cooperate. Someone said something that landed wrong. The email you were counting on didn't arrive. Small things, maybe, barely worth mentioning. But here's what happens in that gap between what you expected and what actually occurred. In that space, something ignites. Frustration, disappointment, anxiety, anger, that tight feeling in your chest, that low-grade irritation that colors the rest of your day. The Buddha had a word for this, dukkha, often translated as suffering, but that's not quite right. Dukkha is more subtle. It's the pervasive unsatisfactoriness of clinging to things as we want them to be, rather than meeting them as they are. It's the suffering that comes from fighting the freight train. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That plan you had for today, that expectation about how things should unfold, where did it come from? You made it. Your mind constructed it, piece by piece, based on past experiences, hopes, fears, desires, and 1,000 other variables. It's a mental model, a prediction, a story you're telling yourself about a future that doesn't exist yet. And there's nothing wrong with that. Planning is part of being human. We orient toward the future. We set goals, make commitments, build towards something. But watch what happens next. We take that mental construct, that fantasy of how things will be, and we attach to it. We grip it tightly. We say, "This is how it must be for me to be happy. This is how it must unfold for me to feel okay about myself, my day, my life." That attachment, that insistence, is what the Buddha called craving. And craving, he taught, is the root of suffering. Not the expectation itself, the rigidity around it, the should that we bolt onto reality. You should have gotten that promotion. The conversation should have gone differently. They should have understood what you meant. The traffic should not exist at this hour. Your body should feel better. The world should be more fair. Each should is a tiny prison bar. String enough of them together, and you've built a cage around your own peace. And here's what's particularly painful about this cage. You're the one who built it. You're the architect of your own confinement. The bars aren't made of steel, but of insistence, of refusal, of demanding that reality be different before you'll allow yourself to rest. Watch how this plays out in the smallest moments of your day. You're making breakfast and you drop a spoon. It clatters on the floor, and immediately there's a flash of irritation. Why? Because you expected breakfast to go smoothly, and now it hasn't. A tiny expectation, a tiny disappointment, a tiny moment of suffering. Multiply that by the dozens or hundreds of small expectations you carry through a single day, and you begin to see why you feel so tired by evening. You've been in subtle battle with reality all day long, fighting 1,000 small freight trains. At a meditation retreat, a woman sat in the opening session as the teacher introduced the theme for the weekend: love and compassion. The foundations of Buddhist practice, the heart of transformation. From across the room, someone sighed. Then a voice, not quite under the breath, said, "Compassion again. I already know about compassion." This woman had attended this retreat for several years running. She was clearly dedicated to her practice, devoted to understanding the Dharma. And, in a way, she was right. She'd heard teachings on compassion many times. She'd been in that room for years, listening to talks about opening the heart, about meeting others with kindness, about recognizing suffering in ourselves and in the world. She'd read books about it. She could probably explain the concept beautifully if asked. But knowing about compassion and being compassionate are two completely different things. You can know the chemical formula for water and still die of thirst. You can memorize every instruction for swimming and still drown if you never get in the pool. You can understand intellectually that expectations cause suffering and still honk at the freight train every single day. This is one of the most important distinctions on the spiritual path. The difference between conceptual understanding and embodied realization. The Buddha taught 3 stages of wisdom. First comes hearing, receiving the information, absorbing the teaching. You listen to a talk, you read a book, you learn that attachment causes suffering. That's stage 1. Second comes reflection, processing that information, examining it from different angles, testing it against your own experience. You think about times you've suffered because of rigid expectations. You analyze the patterns. You begin to see the truth of the teaching in your own life. That's stage 2. But neither of those stages transforms you. Not really. The third stage is meditation, which doesn't mean sitting cross-legged on a cushion. It means returning again and again to the truth, training your mind to rest in that understanding, integrating it so deeply that it becomes your natural response rather than something you have to remember. That woman at the retreat had completed stage 1 many times over. She'd heard about compassion. Maybe she'd even done some stage 2 reflection. But she hadn't yet moved into stage 3, where compassion becomes not something you know, but something you are. And the truth is, most of us haven't either. We're all students. We're all just beginning to understand how deep these teachings go. Even the great teachers, the ones who've studied and practiced for decades, still consider themselves students of the Dharma, because these teachings go all the way down. Love and compassion and patience and acceptance, they reach into the ultimate nature of reality itself. We won't fully embody them until we're very close to awakening. Some teachers give the same teaching 20, 30 times. The same text, the same manual, the same essential truth. And each time, if you really listen with openness, you discover something new. Because these teachings are like mines filled with treasure. They're vast and they're deep, and you can spend a lifetime exploring them without exhausting their wisdom. So the question isn't whether you know about these things. The question is whether you're willing to practice them, to return to them again and again, especially when it's difficult, especially when everything in you wants to honk at the freight train. Let's come back to that moment at the railroad crossing. The train is passing, car after car. You're stuck there, and the person behind you is leaning on the horn. In that moment, that person has 2 choices. Actually, we all have 2 choices every time reality doesn't match our expectations. Choice 1, surrender. And this is a strong word, maybe even an uncomfortable one. Submit, yield, bow to what is. Not in defeat, not in weakness, but in recognition of reality. There is a train. It is blocking your path. No amount of frustration, anger, or horn honking will change that fact. So you can accept it. You can let your body relax into the seat. You can take a breath. You can look at the train, really look at it, and think, here is reality. This is what is happening right now. Maybe you even find something interesting in it. The rhythm of the cars passing, one after another, the graffiti someone painted on the side, a splash of color in the gray afternoon, the unexpected pause in your day, this moment of forced stillness in a life that rarely stops moving. Choice 2. Insist. Refuse to accept what is. Tighten your grip on how things should be. Fight the moment. Resist. Honk the horn. Curse under your breath. Grip the steering wheel. Feel the frustration build in your chest, like a small fire that will burn for the rest of your evening. That frustration, the Buddha taught, is like dry kindling in a forest that hasn't seen rain in months. One small spark and the whole thing goes up in flames. You're already frustrated because you didn't accept the train. You're already tight, already irritated. Then the car in front of you inches forward slightly, and you think they might try to go around, but they don't. That's the spark. Suddenly you're not just annoyed about the train, you're furious at the incompetent driver ahead of you, at the railroad company for running trains during rush hour, at yourself for taking this route, at your boss for making you stay late, at the person you're supposed to meet for not understanding, at life itself for being so relentlessly difficult. All of that from one unaccepted moment. The Buddha could predict your suffering with mathematical precision, not because he was psychic, but because he understood cause and effect. The more rigid your expectations, the more attached you are to things going a certain way, the more you'll suffer when they inevitably don't. It's almost predictable how much frustration you'll experience based on how tightly you're gripping your plan, your idea of how this moment should be, your requirement that reality conform to your preferences before you'll allow yourself to be at peace. And here's what's so tender about this, so heartbreaking, in a way. You're not doing it because you're bad or broken or failing spiritually. You're doing it because you think your happiness lives in the future. You think your happiness is in getting that promotion, having that conversation go well, arriving on time, checking off all the items on your list. You've placed your peace somewhere up ahead, contingent on conditions being just right. But peace doesn't live in the future. It can't. The future is a fantasy, a mental construct, a prediction that may or may not unfold the way you imagine. Peace lives here, right in this moment, exactly as it is. And the only thing standing between you and that peace is your insistence that this moment should be different. Let that land for a second. The only thing between you and peace right now is your argument with reality. Not the traffic, not the difficult person, not the unmet expectation. Your resistance to what is. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught about acceptance as the doorway to peace. He wasn't saying you have to like everything that happens. He wasn't saying you can't work to change difficult situations or grow or improve your circumstances. He was saying something much more radical. He was saying that peace isn't about changing reality to match your preferences. It's about meeting reality exactly as it shows up, without the overlay of resistance, without the should that keeps you in constant battle with the present moment. This isn't passivity. This isn't giving up. It's the opposite. When you stop fighting the train, when you accept that yes, there is a train, and yes, I'm stopped here right now, something miraculous happens. Space opens up. Your nervous system relaxes. And from that relaxed, spacious, accepting place, you can actually respond wisely. Maybe you pull out your phone and send a text letting someone know you'll be late. Maybe you take 3 deep breaths and feel your shoulders drop. Maybe you turn on music you love and let yourself rest for these few unexpected minutes. Maybe you simply sit there, hands loose on the wheel, watching the train pass, marveling at the strange gift of forced stillness. But when you're busy honking at the train, gripping the wheel, building the fire of frustration in your chest, you can't do any of that. You're stuck in reaction, trapped in resistance, suffering unnecessarily. And here's the beautiful, liberating truth at the heart of all of this. You don't have to wait until conditions are perfect to be at peace. You don't have to wait until you get the promotion, until the relationship heals, until your health improves, until the traffic clears. Peace is available right now, in this imperfect moment, with all its frustrations and disappointments and unmet expectations. Not because everything is okay, but because you've stopped demanding that everything be different before you'll allow yourself to rest. That's the invitation. Not to lower your standards or stop caring about your goals or abandon your plans, but to hold them lightly, to meet each moment with openness rather than rigidity, to notice when you're honking at freight trains and gently, compassionately ask yourself, what would it feel like to stop? What would it feel like to surrender to this moment, exactly as it is? Not because you're defeated, but because you're finally ready to stop fighting a battle you can't win. The battle against reality itself. Let's talk about the word that might make you uncomfortable. Acceptance. For some of you, just hearing that word creates resistance, because acceptance sounds like defeat. It sounds like rolling over, giving up, letting people walk all over you. It sounds like resigning yourself to a life you don't want, staying in situations that hurt, surrendering your power to change anything. So, before we go any further, let's be very clear about what acceptance is not. Acceptance is not passivity. It's not lying down in the middle of the road and letting life run you over. It's not staying in a job that's killing your spirit or a relationship that's causing harm. It's not pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. Acceptance is not weakness. It doesn't mean you lack courage or ambition or the ability to stand up for yourself. It doesn't mean you're a doormat or that you've given up on your dreams. And acceptance is absolutely not resignation. It's not the exhausted sigh of someone who's tried everything and failed. It's not despair wearing a spiritual mask. So if acceptance isn't any of those things, what is it? Acceptance is meeting reality exactly as it is in this moment, without the layer of resistance that creates suffering. It's seeing clearly what's actually happening, rather than arguing with it, denying it, or demanding it be different before you'll acknowledge its existence. Think of it this way. Reality is what's already here. The train is blocking the road. The diagnosis came back with news you didn't want. The person you love made a choice you can't control. The promotion went to someone else. Your body hurts in ways it didn't used to. These are facts. They exist. They're happening or have happened, regardless of whether you like them, approve of them, or think they're fair. Resistance is the voice that says, "But this shouldn't be happening. This isn't right. This isn't fair. This isn't what I worked for, hoped for, deserved." And that voice, that resistance, is where your suffering lives. Not in the reality itself, in your refusal to meet it. Here's the teaching that lies at the heart of this understanding. It's simple, almost mathematical in its clarity. Acceptance leads to peace. That's the causation. That's the chain of events. When you accept what is, when you stop fighting the present moment, something in your nervous system relaxes. The tightness in your chest loosens. Your shoulders drop. Your jaw unclenches. And in that relaxation, in that softening, peace becomes possible. Not because everything suddenly got better, but because you stopped making it worse with your resistance. There was a man driving to an important meeting, one of those meetings that felt like it could determine the direction of his career. He'd prepared for weeks. He knew his presentation inside and out. He'd left early, giving himself plenty of time. Then he hit traffic. Not the slow-moving kind where you can at least inch forward. The completely stopped kind. Brake lights stretching to the horizon. Everyone motionless. Trapped. He did what most people do. He checked his phone for alternate routes. But he was on a highway with nowhere to exit. He called ahead to let them know he'd be late. Heard the disappointment in their voices. He gripped the steering wheel and felt his heart start racing, that familiar panic rising in his chest. This was it, his chance, slipping away because of something completely outside his control. The unfairness of it burned in his throat. And then, sitting there in his car, with nowhere to go and nothing to do about it, he remembered something he'd heard once. That you always have a choice about how you meet this moment. So he tried something. He took his hands off the wheel and let them rest in his lap. He took a breath, and then another. And he said out loud, to himself, to the universe, to no one in particular, "This is what's happening right now." Not, "This shouldn't be happening." Not, "This is terrible." Just, "This is what's happening." He felt something shift. Not in the traffic, which remained completely stopped, but in his body. The panic began to recede. His breathing steadied. He looked around and really saw where he was for the first time. The late afternoon sun coming through the window. The person in the car next to him, also stuck, also dealing with their own disappointment. The strange community of strangers, all bound together in this shared moment of complete helplessness. He ended up missing the meeting entirely. By the time traffic cleared, it was over. But something else happened. He called back and explained what had occurred, speaking from a place of calm rather than frantic apology. And because he was calm, because he'd already accepted what couldn't be changed, he was able to think clearly about what could be changed. He proposed a video call for the next day, sent his presentation materials ahead of time, followed up with a thoughtful email. He got the contract, not despite missing the meeting, but perhaps because of how he handled missing it. But what struck him most about that day, what he would carry forward for years, was discovering that he could be okay, even when things didn't go his way. That peace wasn't dependent on everything working out perfectly, that he'd been carrying this belief his whole life, the belief that he could only relax once everything was under control, and it wasn't true. The peace was available all along. He'd just been refusing to access it because he was too busy fighting what is. Let's look at another story, a harder one. A woman in her early 40s went to her doctor for a routine checkup. She'd been feeling tired, more than usual, but she attributed it to stress, to working too much, to getting older. The doctor ran some tests. The diagnosis came back with words no one wants to hear. Chronic illness. Manageable, but not curable. Something she'd live with for the rest of her life. Something that would require adjustments, medications, careful attention to her body's limits. Her first response was denial. This couldn't be right. She got second opinions, third opinions. She researched obsessively, looking for the article or study or treatment that would prove everyone wrong. Then came anger. Why her? She'd taken care of herself, eaten well, exercised. She had things she wanted to do, plans that didn't include managing a chronic condition. It wasn't fair. Then bargaining. Maybe if she changed everything about her lifestyle, if she tried this supplement or that diet, if she meditated enough or prayed enough, it would go away. And finally, for a long time, a kind of low-grade despair, a sense that her life, the life she'd imagined, was over before it had really begun. She lived in this state for months, fighting the diagnosis, resenting her body, grieving the future she'd expected. And the irony was that her resistance, her constant battle with reality, was making her sicker. The stress of non-acceptance was taking a toll as real as the illness itself. Then one morning, sitting in her kitchen with her untouched coffee growing cold, something shifted. She didn't plan it. She wasn't trying to be spiritual or wise. She was just exhausted from fighting. And in that exhaustion, she finally stopped. She looked at her body, this body that had served her faithfully for 42 years, and was now asking for something different from her. And she said, "Okay, This is what's happening. This is my reality now. Not with resignation, not with defeat, but with a kind of tender recognition. This is what is. And when she stopped fighting it, when she finally accepted what was actually happening, rather than exhausting herself trying to make it not be true, something extraordinary occurred. She started living again. Really living. She began to listen to her body in ways she never had before. She learned its new rhythms, its needs, its wisdom. She made the adjustments that were necessary, not with resentment, but with care. She let go of some dreams and discovered new ones. She learned to ask for help, something she'd never been good at. She built a life that worked with her limitations, rather than constantly railing against them. And years later, looking back, she would say something profound. The diagnosis didn't change. I still have this condition, but my suffering around it ended the day I stopped insisting it shouldn't exist. The pain is still there sometimes, but the suffering, that was something I was adding. Pain is inevitable, the Buddha taught. Suffering is optional. Pain is what happens when reality includes difficulty, loss, illness, death. These are part of being human, part of having a body, part of loving people, and things that don't last forever. But suffering is what we create when we refuse to accept that pain is happening, when we layer resistance and denial and anger and "this shouldn't be" on top of the pain that's already present. Acceptance doesn't eliminate pain, but it eliminates the suffering we create by fighting the pain, denying it, or believing we shouldn't have to feel it. One more story, because this pattern shows up everywhere in life. A young man was in a relationship he thought would last forever. 5 years together, plans for marriage, a whole future, carefully constructed in both their imaginations. Then one evening, she told him she couldn't continue. Something fundamental had shifted for her. She still cared about him, but she couldn't be in the relationship anymore. He tried everything to change her mind. He made promises, negotiated, explained all the reasons they should stay together. He replayed every conversation they'd ever had, looking for the moment where things went wrong, the thing he could have done differently. But she was clear. It was over. For months, he lived in a kind of limbo, not quite accepting that it had ended, not quite moving forward. He kept texting her, suggesting they meet for coffee, to talk things through one more time. He kept half of his attention on the possibility that she'd change her mind, that they'd find their way back to each other. His friends worried about him. He'd lost weight. He wasn't sleeping well. He was stuck in a story about how things should be, rather than dealing with how things actually were. Then one night, walking home from work, he stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. People flowed around him, annoyed at the obstacle he'd become, but he just stood there, finally facing the truth he'd been running from. She wasn't coming back. This relationship was over. That future he'd imagined wasn't going to happen. And instead of collapsing under the weight of that truth, he felt something unexpected. Relief. Because the truth, even when it's painful, is solid ground. You can stand on it. You can start from there. But as long as you're living in fantasy, in what should be, or what might be, if only things were different, you're standing on nothing. You're suspended in a kind of suffering that has no end, because you never let yourself arrive at what's real. He went home that night and wrote her one final message, not trying to change her mind or keep a door open, just acknowledging the truth, thanking her for what they'd shared, and saying goodbye. It hurt. Of course it hurt. The pain didn't disappear because he accepted it. But the suffering did. The agonizing, constant suffering of non-acceptance lifted, and in the space that opened up, he could finally begin to grieve, to heal, and eventually to move forward. 6 months later, he would reflect on something profound. When I was fighting the breakup, trying to make it not be true, I was completely stuck. I couldn't move forward because I was using all my energy trying to go backward. The day I accepted it, really accepted it, I had my life back. Not the life I'd planned, but my life. And I could finally start living it. Do you see the pattern in these stories? In all 3 cases, acceptance didn't change the external reality. The traffic didn't clear faster. The diagnosis didn't go away. The relationship didn't magically repair itself. But something profound changed internally. A kind of softening happened. A releasing of the clench, the fight, the endless argument with what is. And in that softening, in that space that opens, when you stop contracting against reality, peace becomes possible. Not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of finally being present with what's actually happening, instead of exhausting yourself wishing it were different. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught that acceptance is the doorway to peace. It's not the only doorway. There are others, but it's the one most of us keep missing because we're so busy looking for a doorway that leads somewhere else. We want the doorway that leads to the life we planned, the circumstances we prefer, the reality where everything goes our way. And we'll stand in front of that locked door for years, decades even, pushing against it, demanding it open, refusing to acknowledge that it's not a door at all. It's a wall we're beating our heads against. Meanwhile, the actual doorway, the one that leads to peace, is right here. It's always been right here. It's simply the doorway of accepting what is. And here's what's so beautiful, so liberating about this teaching. Acceptance doesn't trap you in circumstances you don't want. It's actually the opposite. When you're fighting reality, when you're stuck in non-acceptance, all your energy goes into that fight. You can't see clearly because you're so busy arguing with what you're seeing. You can't act wisely because you're acting from a place of resistance and reactivity. But when you accept what is, when you meet reality clearly, without the fog of resistance, something miraculous happens. You can finally respond instead of react. You can ask, okay, this is what's happening. Given this reality, what's the wisest thing to do? The man in traffic, once he accepted he'd missed the meeting, could think clearly about next steps. The woman with the diagnosis, once she accepted her condition, could make wise choices about her treatment and lifestyle. The young man, once he accepted the breakup, could begin the actual work of healing rather than staying stuck in fantasy. Acceptance creates space. Space for clarity, for wisdom, for action that actually helps, rather than action that comes from panic and denial. Think about it in your own life. When you're fighting something, resisting it, how much energy does that take? How much mental space does it occupy? How much of your day is spent in that internal battle? Now imagine what would become available if you could redirect that energy, not toward resignation or passivity, but toward wise, clear-eyed action based on reality as it actually is. That's the gift of acceptance. It frees up everything you've been using to fight the unchangeable and makes it available for engaging skillfully with what can actually be changed. But here's the thing about acceptance that nobody tells you. It's not a one-time event. It's not like you accept something once and then you're done. Acceptance is a practice, a returning, something you have to choose again and again, especially with the hard things, the things that hurt, the things that feel unfair. The woman with the chronic illness didn't accept once and never struggle again. There were mornings when she woke up and felt the familiar resistance rising, the why me, the grief for the life she'd imagined. But she'd learned something crucial. She'd learned how to recognize that resistance and how to soften around it, how to come back to acceptance even when it was hard. This is the practice. This is what we're actually training in. Not becoming people who never resist or never wish things were different, but becoming people who can recognize when we're resisting and choose to meet reality instead of fighting it. And slowly, gradually, that choice becomes easier. The pathway of acceptance gets worn smooth from walking it so many times. The softening becomes more familiar than the clenching. Peace becomes more accessible than suffering. Not because your life becomes perfect, but because you've stopped requiring perfection as the price of your peace. There's a teaching that appears often in Buddhist texts. Trying to avoid pain by controlling circumstances is like trying to cover the whole earth in leather, so you never have to encounter rough ground. It's impossible, exhausting, and completely misses the point. The alternative? Put on shoes. Cover your own feet. Develop the inner resources to walk through life as it actually is, rather than exhausting yourself trying to pave every path ahead of time. Acceptance is how you put on shoes. It's how you develop the capacity to walk through difficult terrain without being destroyed by it. It's how you build resilience, not by avoiding pain, but by learning to meet it without adding layers of suffering on top. And the peace that comes from acceptance is different from the peace of everything going your way. The peace of everything going your way is fragile. It depends on circumstances remaining favorable, on people behaving the way you want, on life cooperating with your plans. It's conditional peace, and conditions change constantly. But the peace that comes from acceptance, from meeting reality as it is, that's stable. It doesn't depend on circumstances being perfect. It's available in traffic, and in illness, and in heartbreak. It's available on the worst day of your life, and on the most ordinary day. Because it's not peace despite what's happening. It's peace that includes what's happening, that makes room for all of it, the joy and the pain, the success and the failure, the plans that work out and the ones that fall apart. This is the doorway you've been missing. Not the doorway to a perfect life, but the doorway to being at peace with the life you actually have. And standing in that doorway right now, maybe you're thinking, this sounds beautiful, but I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I have what it takes to accept things, especially the hard things, the unfair things, the losses I never wanted to face. And you're right to wonder, because acceptance requires something you might think you don't have enough of. Something you've probably never considered a spiritual practice. Something that sounds ordinary but turns out to be the key to everything. It requires patience. When most of us hear the word patience, we think of one thing: waiting, tolerating difficult people, not losing our temper when someone cuts us off in traffic, or when the customer service line keeps us on hold for 40 minutes. But in Buddhist teaching, patience is much more than that. It's not just about controlling your frustration when others irritate you. It's actually one of the most profound practices on the path to freedom, one of the most powerful antidotes to suffering. The Buddha taught 3 types of patience, 3 branches growing from the same trunk. And if you can develop these 3 forms of patience, you'll find that most of your suffering begins to dissolve. The first type is the one we're most familiar with: patience with other people. Patience when someone treats you poorly, when they don't understand, when they say the wrong thing, or do the wrong thing, or simply exist in a way that irritates you. Let's start there, because that's where most of us struggle most visibly. Think about the last time someone really got under your skin. Maybe it was someone close to you, someone whose behavior you've been trying to change for years. Maybe it was a stranger, someone you'll never see again but who managed to ruin your afternoon with one careless action. Why did they trigger you so strongly? Why did their words or actions create such turbulence inside you? Here's what most people don't realize. When someone triggers you, when they provoke a strong reaction in you, they're not creating something new. They're revealing something that was already there. They're holding up a mirror, and what you see in that mirror, what you react to so strongly, is often something about yourself that you haven't wanted to look at. The person who criticizes you triggers the part of you that already criticizes yourself. The person who seems lazy triggers your own fear of not being productive enough. The person who needs attention triggers the part of you that feels unseen. This doesn't mean the other person's behavior is okay. It doesn't mean you have to accept mistreatment or that everything is your fault. But it does mean that the intensity of your reaction often tells you more about your inner landscape than it does about the other person. There's wisdom in an old teaching that says everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The person who was rude this morning might be caring for a dying parent. The colleague who snapped might be dealing with chronic pain. The stranger who cut you off in traffic might have just received devastating news. You don't know. You can't know. All you see is the surface behavior, and you judge it based on your own expectations and needs. There's a test for this, one that reveals where you really stand with patience and kindness. Pay attention to how you treat people who can't do anything for you. The server at the restaurant, the person who cleans the office building, the cashier at the grocery store, the stranger asking for directions on the street. How do you speak to them? With the same kindness and respect you'd give your boss or someone you're trying to impress? Or with something less, something dismissive, something that reveals you see them more as functions than as fellow human beings? This test is so revealing because these interactions cost you nothing. There's no strategic benefit to being kind to the waiter. They're not going to advance your career or introduce you to someone important. So how you treat them shows who you are, when there's no incentive to perform kindness, when you're just being yourself. Think about the person who's pleasant and charming in meetings with executives, but dismissive or rude to the receptionist on the way out. That disparity reveals something important. It shows that the kindness in the meeting wasn't really kindness at all. It was strategy, performance, self-interest, disguised as courtesy. Real kindness doesn't discriminate based on who can help you. It extends to everyone because it comes from a different place entirely, from seeing the shared humanity in every person you encounter, regardless of their status or what they can do for you. A woman worked in a busy office, surrounded by colleagues who found her exhausting. She was meticulous, to the point of obsession, questioning every decision, slowing down every project with her need to triple-check everything. She'd send emails late at night asking detailed questions about work that could easily wait until morning. She'd redo her own completed tasks if she found even the tiniest error. People whispered about her. They thought she was neurotic, controlling, making everyone's life harder with her perfectionism. They avoided working with her when they could. Then one day, during a team lunch, the conversation turned personal. Someone asked about childhoods, about what shaped people. And this woman, who usually kept herself so carefully controlled, shared something she rarely talked about. Her father had been an alcoholic, not the kind who drank quietly at home, but the unpredictable kind, the volatile kind. As a child, she'd learned that the only way to stay safe was to be perfect, to never give him a reason to turn his attention, his anger toward her. She'd become hypervigilant, checking and rechecking everything, anticipating problems before they arose, creating order in a chaotic environment because order meant safety. These patterns had kept her alive as a child. But now, decades later, they were keeping her trapped. She knew this. She was working with a therapist, trying to unlearn what had once been necessary for survival, but was now just exhausting. But healing doesn't happen overnight. Neural pathways formed in childhood run deep. You can't just decide to stop being hypervigilant when hypervigilance kept you safe for 18 years. The people listening around that table felt something shift. Their judgments softened. Their irritation transformed into something closer to tenderness. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She was trying to survive using the only tools she'd ever learned. And everyone who'd been annoyed by her perfectionism had completely missed what was actually happening. Someone doing her very best to function while carrying a childhood that still lived in her nervous system. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught about seeing the suffering behind behavior. Every difficult person you encounter is suffering in some way. Their behavior, the thing that triggers you, is often their unskillful attempt to deal with that suffering. The aggressive person is often afraid. The controlling person often feels powerless. The person who needs constant validation often carries deep wounds of not being seen. And when you can see that, when you can look past the irritating behavior to the suffering underneath, something shifts. Not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually. Your impatience softens, your judgments quiet, and what emerges is something closer to compassion. This doesn't mean you have to tolerate harmful behavior. You can set boundaries, protect yourself, walk away from situations that aren't healthy. But you can do all of that without the overlay of harsh judgment, without the story that this person is fundamentally wrong or bad or less worthy of kindness than anyone else. They're just human, struggling like you, doing their best with limited tools and old wounds and fears they might not even be aware of. That's the first type of patience. Patience with others, even when they're difficult, even when they trigger you, even when they seem to be making your life harder. Now let's talk about the second type, one that's even more challenging for most people. Patience with your own growth. When you start any new practice, whether it's meditation, or learning an instrument, or changing a habit, there's usually a honeymoon phase. Everything is new and interesting. You're excited about the possibility of transformation. The novelty itself creates a kind of pleasure. Someone starts meditating, and it feels profound. They sit there for 20 minutes and think, "This is it. This is the answer. I'm going to do this every day for the rest of my life." The practice feels magical during this phase. Every session seems to offer something new, a moment of calm, an insight, a sense of possibility. It's easy to be consistent. because you're being carried by enthusiasm. But then something happens. Usually, after a few weeks or months, the newness wears off. The practice becomes familiar, predictable, and instead of feeling inspired, you start to feel bored. This is the second stage, the disenchantment. The meditation cushion starts to feel uncomfortable. Your mind wanders more than it settles. 20 minutes feels very long, and you start checking the timer. The practice that once felt like a doorway to something profound now feels like a chore, another item on an already overwhelming to-do list. And this is where most people quit. They think, this isn't working for me anymore. Maybe I need a different technique, a different teacher, a different approach. They go looking for the next thing that will recreate that honeymoon feeling, that initial spark of excitement and possibility. And they find it, briefly, before that too becomes familiar, and they're looking again. But here's what nobody tells you. The practice hasn't stopped working. You've just moved past the stage where it works by being novel and exciting. Now it's asking you to work in a different way. The boredom is actually your graduation ceremony. It's the signal that you're ready for the real practice to begin. Because in the honeymoon phase, the practice was choosing you. Your emotional reaction to it, your curiosity about it, your excitement, those things pulled you toward the cushion. You didn't need discipline because you were being carried by enthusiasm. But when the practice becomes familiar, when the novelty wears off, now you get to choose it. Now you're building something real. You're training the capacity to show up even when you don't feel like it, to choose what you value over what you want in the moment. This is where transformation actually happens. Not in the exciting moments, but in the boring ones. Not when practice feels good, but when it feels like nothing special, and you do it anyway. A man started meditating after his marriage ended. The divorce had left him unmoored, anxious, unable to sleep through the night. Someone suggested meditation, and he tried it, more out of desperation than genuine interest. At first, it was hard. His mind wouldn't settle. He'd sit there replaying arguments, imagining different outcomes, drowning in regret and what-ifs. But gradually, over weeks, he started to notice changes. He could take a breath and actually feel himself calm down. He could watch a thought arise and not immediately believe it, not immediately get swept away by it. He started sleeping better. The constant anxiety began to soften. He became devoted to the practice. Every morning, 30 minutes on the cushion before anything else. It felt like the most important thing he did all day, the foundation that made everything else possible. But after about 6 months, something shifted. The practice started to feel routine. Some mornings, he'd sit there thinking about his work schedule. Other mornings, he'd fall asleep. It stopped feeling like a revelation and started feeling like just sitting there, watching the clock, waiting for it to be over. He almost quit. The voice in his head said, Maybe I've gotten what I needed from this. Maybe it's time to try something else. But something made him keep showing up. Maybe stubbornness, maybe intuition, maybe just the simple fact that he'd built a habit and didn't want to break it. Even on the mornings when it felt pointless, when his mind wandered constantly, when he couldn't remember why he'd ever thought this was helpful, he kept sitting down on that cushion. And slowly, over months, something shifted again. Not back to the honeymoon phase, not back to that initial excitement. Something different entirely. He stopped caring whether the session felt good, or profound, or peaceful. He stopped evaluating each sit as successful or unsuccessful. He started to understand that the practice was working not in those special moments of clarity, but in the ordinary moments of just showing up. The muscle he was building wasn't the muscle of having peaceful meditations. It was the muscle of consistency, of choosing to care for himself even when it wasn't entertaining, of returning to what mattered, even when what mattered felt boring. This was the third stage, the mature practice, where you no longer need the practice to feel good because you understand it's nourishing you, whether it feels good or not. Years later, looking back, he realized something profound. The practice didn't save his life during the honeymoon phase when everything felt magical. It saved his life in the disenchantment phase, in the boring middle, when he learned that he could be consistent with something even when it wasn't exciting. That capacity, the capacity to show up for what matters even when it's not stimulating, that's what actually transforms you. That's what builds a real foundation for change. This is the second type of patience. Patience with your own growth. Patience with the slowness of transformation, with the inevitable boring middle, with the disenchantment that's actually a doorway rather than a dead end. And then there's the third type, perhaps the most subtle, and in some ways, the most challenging. Patience with uncomfortable truth. There are truths about reality that we don't want to hear, truths that threaten our sense of control, our ideas about how things should be, our stories about who we are. Impermanence. For one, everything changes. Everything ends. The job you love, the health you have, the people you cherish, none of it is permanent. You know this intellectually, but really letting it in, really accepting it, is another matter entirely. Or the truth about control. How little of life you actually control. You can influence things, work toward outcomes, make wise choices, but you can't control whether you get sick, whether the people you love will stay, whether your plans will work out. Or the truth about who you are, that you're not as patient as you think, not as selfless, not as wise, not as far along the path as you'd like to believe. These truths are uncomfortable. They put cracks in the stories we tell ourselves, and our first instinct is usually to reject them, to defend against them, to find reasons why they don't apply to us, or why they're not really true. But spiritual growth requires patience with uncomfortable truth. It requires the willingness to hear things that challenge you, that show you where you're still stuck, that reveal the ways you're creating your own suffering. And here's where it gets tricky. Because once you start on a spiritual path, once you identify as someone who's working on themselves, your ego doesn't disappear. It just moves into a smaller box. Before, you were living in the box of regular life. The ego could seek status through money or appearance or achievements or social position. But now you've decided to be spiritual, to work on yourself, to pursue enlightenment. So the ego has to adapt. It has to find new ways to feel important, new ways to be better than others, new ways to avoid the discomfort of ordinary humanness. It starts collecting spiritual knowledge like trophies, taking pride in how many retreats you've attended, how many hours you've meditated, how much you know about Buddhist philosophy. It compares your practice to others' practices and finds ways to feel superior. Or it becomes invested in being seen as humble, as selfless, as someone who's really making progress, which is just another form of seeking specialness, another way the ego maintains its sense of importance. This is what the teachings call the ego, dressed in spiritual clothes. And it's more dangerous than the ordinary ego because it's harder to see, easier to rationalize, more subtle in its operations. The ordinary ego is obvious. You can see when someone is being arrogant, selfish, status-seeking. But the spiritual ego hides behind beautiful words and seemingly selfless actions. It's much harder to recognize, especially in yourself. There's a teaching that appears in many meditation manuals, particularly in Tibet. It says that of all the ways to measure spiritual progress, the most reliable isn't how much you know or how many practices you've mastered. It's how much your self-obsession has decreased. How centered are you on yourself, on your own needs, your own comfort, your own perspective, your own feelings? How often do you use words like I and me and mine? Researchers actually studied this. They brought volunteers into a room and told them to wait while they prepared an experiment. But the real experiment had already started. Hidden cameras and microphones recorded the volunteers as they sat there making small talk with each other. The researchers counted how many times each person used self-referential words in casual conversation. I, me, my, mine. Just normal conversation about their lives, their opinions, their experiences. Then they followed up with these volunteers months and years later, tracking their psychological well-being, their relationships, their career trajectories, even their physical health. What they found was striking. The people who used the most self-referential language in that brief waiting room conversation had significantly more psychological problems down the line. More depression, more anxiety, more difficulty in relationships and careers, even more physical health issues. Not because saying I causes these problems, but because frequent self-reference is a marker of self-obsession. and self-obsession the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago is the root of suffering. When you're constantly focused on yourself, on how things affect you, on whether you're getting what you want, on protecting your image and your interests, you're trapped in a very small world. A world where everything has to revolve around your needs and preferences for you to feel okay. But the more you can step out of that self-centered view, the more you can consider other perspectives, hold your own needs lightly, recognize that you're just one person among billions, all trying to find their way, the more spacious life becomes. The more peace becomes possible. So when someone tells you a truth that threatens your self-image, what happens? When a teacher points out a blind spot, when a friend gives you feedback you didn't want to hear, when life itself shows you where you're still creating suffering. This is where patience with uncomfortable truth matters. The patience to listen without immediately defending. To consider that maybe you're wrong about something you were sure you were right about. To let your identity be challenged without collapsing or armoring against it. There's a particular kind of humility required for this. Not the false humility of putting yourself down, but the genuine humility of recognizing that you're always a student. That there's always more to learn. That the people and situations that irritate you might have something important to teach you if you're willing to listen. This humility is what opens everything. When you can say, I don't know. When you can admit, I was wrong. When you can hear criticism without immediately defending yourself, you become available for real transformation. Because transformation requires change, and change requires admitting that the way you've been doing things, the way you've been seeing things, might not be serving you, might, in fact, be creating the very suffering you're trying to escape. These three types of patience: patience with others, patience with your own growth, patience with uncomfortable truth. They're like three branches of a tree. And if we look at what they share, at the trunk from which all three grow, we find something beautiful. They all require acceptance. They all require you to stop fighting with reality and start meeting it as it is. Patience with others requires accepting that people are who they are, not who you wish they'd be. That they're doing the best they can with the tools and understanding they have, even when their best seems inadequate to you. Patience with your own growth requires accepting that transformation is slow, that you can't skip stages, that boring and difficult phases are part of the process, not problems to be solved, or evidence that something's wrong. Patience with uncomfortable truth requires accepting that reality doesn't care about your preferences, that impermanence and lack of control are features of existence, not bugs, and that your ego will resist these truths until the day you finally, fully let them in. And underneath all of that acceptance is peace. The peace that comes when you finally stop fighting, stop resisting, stop demanding that this moment be different before you'll allow yourself to rest. That's the trunk of the tree. Acceptance leading to peace. And from that peace, from that grounded, spacious, softened place, wise action becomes possible. Not reaction, not resistance, but response. Measured, clear, aligned with your deepest values, rather than your momentary frustrations. So, when that difficult person triggers you tomorrow, you'll have a choice. You can react from that old place of impatience and judgment, or you can pause, take a breath, and remember that they're fighting battles you can't see. When your practice feels boring next week, when the excitement has worn off and you're tempted to quit, you'll have a choice. You can give up and start looking for the next shiny thing, or you can recognize that you've graduated to the stage where real transformation becomes possible. When life shows you a truth you don't want to see, when someone points out a blind spot, or when circumstances reveal your lack of control, you'll have a choice. You can defend, deny, and stay stuck, or you can soften into the humility that opens everything. These aren't easy choices. Patience isn't easy, but it's possible, and it gets easier with practice. The pathway gets worn smooth from walking it again and again, until one day you realize that patience has become not something you're trying to cultivate, but something you are. It's woven into how you meet the world, how you meet others, how you meet yourself. And in that patient meeting, in that accepting presence, suffering begins to dissolve. Not because everything becomes perfect, but because you've stopped requiring perfection as the price of your peace. Before we can accept, before we can practice patience, before we can transform anything at all, we have to learn something that sounds almost too simple to matter. We have to learn how to listen. Not hearing, listening. There's a world of difference between the two. You can hear something 100 times and never really listen to it. The words enter your ears, bounce around in your mind for a moment, and then disappear without leaving any real trace. You've heard it, but you haven't received it. You haven't let it in. And here's what most people don't realize. You can't integrate what you haven't truly heard. You can't practice what you haven't genuinely received. You can't embody wisdom that never made it past your ears. This is why the same teachings get repeated over and over in spiritual traditions. Not because the teachers have run out of things to say, but because hearing something once, or even 10 times, doesn't mean you've actually listened to it. Think about the most important truths in your life. The things that actually changed you, that shifted something fundamental in how you see, or act, or relate to the world. How many times did you hear those truths before you really listened? Someone tells you that you need to slow down, that you're burning yourself out. You hear them, you nod, maybe you even agree, but you don't change anything. They tell you again a month later, again a few months after that. You hear them every time, but you're not listening. Then one day, Maybe after your body finally forces you to stop. Maybe after you miss something that matters because you were too exhausted to be present. Something shifts. And you hear that same truth. You need to slow down. And this time, it lands differently. This time you actually listen. What changed? Not the words. Not the truth being spoken. What changed was your willingness to receive it. The Buddha taught that wisdom comes in 3 stages. First comes hearing, receiving information, being exposed to the teaching. Second comes reflection, processing that information, examining it, testing it against your experience. Third comes meditation, integrating the truth so deeply that it becomes part of who you are. But everything depends on that first stage. If you don't truly listen, if you don't genuinely receive the teaching, you have nothing to reflect on, nothing to integrate, nothing to practice. So what does it mean to really listen? There's an analogy that appears in traditional teachings about this. Imagine there's a deep canyon between you and the truth being communicated. You're standing on one side, the teaching is on the other. For that truth to reach you, for you to receive it, a bridge needs to be built. And that bridge requires effort from both sides. The person teaching, the person speaking, has to meet you where you are. They have to find language that connects with your experience, examples that resonate with your life, ways of explaining that don't require you to already understand what they're trying to teach you. They're building their side of the bridge toward you. But you have to build from your side too. You have to reach toward the teaching with genuine curiosity, with effort, with openness. You have to work to extract the meaning behind the words, to understand what's being pointed at, even when the pointing isn't perfect. Neither side can do all the work. If the teacher uses language that's completely inaccessible, references experiences you've never had, assumes knowledge you don't have, their side of the bridge ends in mid-air. You can't reach it, no matter how hard you try. But if you don't extend any effort at all, if you just wait passively for understanding to arrive without working to grasp it, your side of the bridge never leaves the ground. The teacher can build as skillfully as they want, but you'll never meet them. Listening is that meeting in the middle. It's the moment when both sides of the bridge connect, and something can actually cross over from one understanding to another. But something gets in the way of this meeting. Something blocks most people from genuinely listening most of the time. Pride. Not the obvious kind of pride, not arrogance or superiority. Something more subtle. The pride of thinking you already know. You hear the first few words of a teaching and you think, I've heard this before. You recognize a concept and you assume you understand it fully. You notice similarities to something you've read and you stop paying attention because you think you've already gotten what this has to offer. This is pride disguised as knowledge, and it closes the door to genuine listening before the listening can even begin. There's a story about a teacher who would give the same teaching repeatedly, year after year, retreat after retreat, the same text, the same essential message, the same core insights. Some students would come once, hear the teaching, and never return. They'd think, "I've learnt that now. Time to move on to something new." But other students would come back year after year, hearing the same teaching 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. And each time they'd discover something new. Some layer they hadn't seen before, some depth they hadn't recognized, some application they hadn't considered. What was the difference between these students? Not intelligence, not dedication. The difference was that the students who kept coming back understood something crucial. They understood that these teachings aren't information to be collected. They're depths to be explored. They're minds full of treasure, and you can spend a lifetime digging and still find new riches. Love, compassion, patience, acceptance. These aren't concepts you learn once and check off your list. They're realities that go all the way down to the nature of existence itself. You won't fully understand them until you're close to complete awakening. So the attitude of, "I already know this," is actually the attitude that guarantees you won't learn anything, because you've closed yourself off before the teaching even has a chance to reach you. This is why humility is essential for learning. Not the false humility of putting yourself down, but the genuine humility of recognizing that no matter how much you know, there's always more to discover. The mind needs to be open, but not so open that, as the saying goes, your brain falls out. An open mind doesn't mean believing everything you hear or accepting every teaching without question. It means being willing to consider ideas that challenge your current understanding, to sit with concepts that seem strange or uncomfortable, to explore perspectives that don't immediately align with what you already believe. The art of listening requires a particular kind of openness. You're not listening to verify what you already think. You're not filtering for the parts that confirm your existing beliefs and rejecting everything else. You're listening to discover something new, to let in something that might actually change you. This means suspending judgment temporarily, not forever. You'll evaluate and test what you've heard in the second stage, in reflection. But while you're listening, while you're receiving, you set aside the constant internal commentary of, "I agree, I disagree, this is right, this is wrong." You just listen. You let the teaching land. You receive it fully before you start analyzing it. Most people don't do this. Most people are so busy judging what they're hearing, comparing it to what they already know, preparing their counter-arguments or their agreements, that they never actually hear the teaching at all. They're having a conversation with themselves about what's being said, rather than simply receiving what's being said. Think about the last time you were in a conversation where you were already planning your response while the other person was still talking. You weren't listening. You were waiting for your turn to speak. using their talking time to rehearse your own thoughts. This is what most of us do with teachings, with wisdom, with truths we need to hear. We're so busy relating it to ourselves, to our existing frameworks, to our current understanding, that we never let the teaching speak for itself. But here's what changes when you really listen. When you set aside the pride that says, "I already know this," the fear that says, "This might challenge me," the busyness that says, "I'm too distracted to pay attention." When you listen with genuine openness, with humility, with the recognition that you're a student, no matter how much you've learned, something shifts. The teaching has room to enter, the truth has space to land, and you become available for the kind of learning that actually transforms, rather than just informing. This doesn't just apply to spiritual teachings. It applies to your own life, to the wisdom your experience is trying to teach you. Your body speaks to you constantly, telling you when it's tired, when it needs rest, when it's holding tension, when something's wrong. But how often do you listen? Your emotions arise with information. Anger often points to a boundary that's been crossed. Anxiety often signals that you're trying to control something outside your control. Sadness often asks you to grieve what's been lost. But do you listen to what they're trying to tell you? Or do you just try to make them go away? Your relationships offer constant feedback. The way people respond to you, the patterns that keep repeating, the conflicts that arise again and again, these are all trying to teach you something. But are you listening, or are you too busy defending, explaining, justifying? Life itself is constantly offering you teachings. Every frustration is pointing at an attachment. Every disappointment is revealing an expectation. Every difficulty is showing you where you're still resisting, where you haven't accepted, where you're fighting reality. But you can't learn from any of this if you're not listening. If you're too busy arguing with what is, too invested in your story about how things should be, too defended against any information that challenges your current understanding. Learning to listen to your life with the same openness, humility, and genuine curiosity you'd bring to a powerful teaching, this is how you turn every moment into a teacher. When you drop your keys and feel irritation rise, that's a teaching about expectation and control. Are you listening? When someone's behavior triggers you, that's a teaching about what's unresolved in you. Are you listening? When you feel resistance to doing something you know is good for you, that's a teaching about how your mind works, about the patterns that keep you stuck. Are you listening? Most of us aren't. Most of us move through life half-deaf, missing most of what our experience is trying to teach us, because we're too busy, too defended, too sure we already know. But the practice of listening can be developed. Like any skill, it gets stronger with use. Start with small things. The next time someone speaks to you, really listen. Don't plan your response. Don't judge what they're saying. Don't let your mind wander to your to-do list. Just receive their words, their meaning, their intention. Notice how hard this is. Notice how quickly your mind wants to jump in with commentary, with judgment, with its own agenda. Then gently bring yourself back to listening. Again and again. Do the same with teachings you encounter. When you read something or hear something that seems familiar, pause. Instead of thinking, "I already know this," ask yourself, what am I still missing? What layer haven't I seen yet? How might this understanding go deeper than I've realized? And practice listening to your own experience. When you feel frustrated, before you react, pause and ask, what is this frustration trying to teach me? When you feel resistance, ask, what am I avoiding? What truth am I not ready to hear? When you feel peace, ask, what created this? What can I learn from this moment of ease? This is the art of listening. And it's not passive. It's one of the most active, engaged practices you can develop. Because real listening requires you to set aside everything that keeps you defended and separate. Your pride, your fear, your busyness, your certainty that you already understand. It requires you to become vulnerable to being changed by what you hear. And that vulnerability, that openness, that willingness to be a student, this is what makes transformation possible. Once you've truly listened, once you've genuinely received a teaching with openness and humility, something magical happens. You have something real to work with, not just words you've heard, but truth you've received. And now you can begin the second stage, the work that turns hearing into understanding. Now you can begin to reflect. You've listened. You've received the teaching with openness and humility. Now comes the work of making it yours. This is the second stage of wisdom, reflection. And it's crucial to understand what this stage is and what it isn't. Reflection is not meditation. These are distinct stages that serve different purposes, and confusing them is one of the main reasons people get stuck in their practice. When you're listening, you're receiving information, you're absorbing content, taking in the teaching, opening yourself to new understanding. That's the first stage. When you're reflecting, you're processing that information. You're examining it from different angles, testing it against your experience, analyzing how it works, understanding the relationships between different parts. That's the second stage. When you're meditating, the third stage, you're integrating the truth. You're returning to it again and again, familiarizing yourself with it so deeply that it becomes part of who you are, rather than just something you know. Don't mix these stages. When you're listening, don't jump ahead to analyzing or integrating. Just receive. When you're reflecting, don't expect to be transformed yet. You're still working with concepts, still in the realm of thinking and understanding. The transformation comes later, in the third stage, when you practice returning to the truth over and over until it rewires how you actually respond to life. So what does reflection actually look like? How do you process a teaching in a way that leads to real understanding rather than just mental gymnastics? There's a method that can help with this, an analogy that makes the work of reflection clearer and more concrete. Think of a teaching as a tree. Every tree has 3 levels: the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. The leaves are specific expressions, particular instances, concrete examples. They're the most visible part, the part you encounter first, the surface level of the teaching. The branches are broader categories, different variations of the same essential thing. Multiple leaves grow from each branch, and the leaves on one branch share something in common that distinguishes them from leaves on other branches. The trunk is the essence, the core, what all the branches share. It's the fundamental truth that manifests in different ways through the branches and finds specific expression in each leaf. When you're reflecting on a teaching, you're trying to move from the leaves to the trunk, from the specific examples to the underlying essence. Because once you understand the essence, you gain something powerful, the ability to apply the teaching in any situation, not just the ones that were explicitly described. Let's work with a real example so you can see how this unfolds. In Buddhist teaching, there are 4 qualities called the 4 immeasurables, or the 4 aspects of love: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. These are 4 branches, and each branch has many leaves. A leaf on the loving kindness branch might be offering a kind word to someone who's struggling. Another leaf might be making soup for a sick friend. Another might be simply smiling at a stranger who looks sad. Each of these is a specific expression of loving kindness in a particular situation. A leaf on the compassion branch might be sitting with someone while they cry. Another might be working to address systemic suffering. Another might be feeling moved by news of disaster halfway across the world. Specific expressions of compassion. A leaf on the empathetic joy branch might be genuinely celebrating a friend's success. Another might be delighting in a child's laughter. Another might be feeling happiness when you hear good news about someone you barely know. Specific expressions of empathetic joy. And a leaf on the equanimity branch might be remaining steady when praised or criticized. Another might be treating a difficult person with the same respect as an easy person. Another might be maintaining balance when circumstances change dramatically. Specific expressions of equanimity. These are the leaves, countless specific instances of these 4 qualities manifesting in daily life. Now, the work of reflection asks, what do these 4 branches share? What's the trunk? You have loving kindness, which wishes others to be happy. You have compassion, which wishes others to be free from suffering. You have empathetic joy, which delights in others' happiness. You have equanimity, which maintains steadiness. and impartiality. What connects them? What's the essential quality that all four share? This is the work of reflection. Sitting with this question, examining each branch, looking for what unites them. And what emerges is this: all four are expressions of the heart that's no longer caught in separation. All four arise from seeing that your well-being and others' well-being are connected, not separate. All four move beyond the prison of me versus them into the spaciousness of us. That's the trunk. The overcoming of separation, the dissolution of the artificial boundary between self and other. And once you understand that trunk, once you grasp that essence, something powerful becomes available. You can contextualize these qualities in any situation. You don't need to be told the exact formula for how to be loving with your difficult coworker, your elderly parent, your ex-partner, your neighbor's loud dog. You understand the essence, moving beyond separation, and you can figure out how that expresses appropriately in each unique context. This is why understanding the trunk gives you flexibility and power. You're no longer limited to the specific examples you've been given, the exact situations that were described in the teaching. You can take the essence and apply it everywhere. Let's look at another example, one we've already explored in depth. Patience. Remember, there are 3 types of patience. 3 branches. Patience with others, tolerating the difficulties that come from other people's behavior. Patience with your own growth, tolerating the discomfort and slowness of transformation. Patience with uncomfortable truth, tolerating realities that challenge your sense of control or your ideas about how things should be. 3 distinct branches, each with countless leaves. Specific moments when you practice patience with your partner's habits, with your child's questions, with your colleagues' mistakes. Specific moments when you show up for meditation, even though it's boring, when you keep practicing, even though progress feels invisible. Specific moments when you accept that you're aging, that people die, that you can't control outcomes. But what's the trunk? What do all 3 types of patience share? The work of reflection reveals this. The trunk has 2 parts, like the bark and the heartwood of a tree. The causal part is acceptance. All 3 types of patience require accepting what is, accepting that this person is behaving this way right now, accepting that growth is slow and includes boring phases, accepting truths that are uncomfortable but real. The resultant part is peace. When you accept what is, when you stop fighting reality, peace becomes possible. Not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of no longer being in battle with the present moment. So the trunk of patience is this movement, acceptance leading to peace. And once you understand this trunk, this essence, you don't need specific instructions for every situation where patience is required. You understand what creates patience at its root, the practice of accepting what is, and you can apply that anywhere. Your train is late? Accept that this is what's happening right now. Your body isn't cooperating with your plans. Accept what your body is actually capable of today. Your spiritual practice feels dry. Accept that this is the current phase. Each acceptance opens the doorway to peace, to patience, to freedom from the suffering of resistance. This is the power of understanding essence. You're not trapped in formulas and specific scenarios. You understand how the quality actually works, what creates it, what it's made of. And from that understanding, you can generate the appropriate response in any situation you encounter. But how do you practice this kind of reflection in your daily life? How do you move from leaves to trunk when you're dealing with real situations, not just analyzing teachings? Start by looking for patterns. When do you feel most at peace? What are the different situations where peace arises? And what do they have in common? That common element is pointing you toward the trunk. When do you feel most frustrated? What are the various triggers and what connects them? You might discover that beneath all the different frustrations is a single pattern: unmet expectations, loss of control, threats to your self-image. This is reflection, looking for the essence beneath the expressions, finding the trunk that connects the branches. A woman spent years working on being more loving. She read books about love, attended workshops, learned techniques for expressing affection and kindness. And she did become more loving with her children, with her friends, with her partner. But then she'd encounter situations that didn't fit the formulas she'd learned. A difficult person at work who seemed to require a completely different approach. An elderly parent whose needs confused her. A former friend who'd hurt her deeply and kept trying to reconnect. She didn't know how to be loving in these situations because they didn't match the examples she'd been given. She had the leaves, but she didn't understand the trunk. Then one day, in a moment of frustration with her own confusion, she sat down and asked herself a different question. Not, how should I act in this specific situation? But, what is love actually made of? What's the essence that connects all the different ways it manifests? She reflected on times when she genuinely expressed love, making her daughter's favorite meal when she was sad, listening to her friend vent about work for the third time that week, setting a boundary with her partner when his behavior was hurting their relationship. Wait, setting a boundary? Was that loving? She'd always thought of love as saying yes, as accommodating, as being soft and accepting. But that boundary, that clear no, had actually been one of the most loving things she'd ever done. She kept reflecting, examining different expressions of love from her life, looking for what they shared. And she found it. The trunk. Love, in all its forms, was about holding someone's well-being in your awareness and acting in service of it. Sometimes that meant comfort, Sometimes it meant challenge. Sometimes it meant saying yes. Sometimes it meant saying no. Sometimes it meant closeness. Sometimes it meant distance. But the essence was always the same: genuine care for another person's true well-being, not just their temporary comfort or approval. Once she understood this trunk, this essence, everything changed. She could navigate any situation, even the ones that didn't fit her formulas. The difficult co-worker, what would serve their genuine well-being? Not enabling their difficult behavior, not avoiding conflict to keep things comfortable, but clear, honest communication with kindness. The elderly parent, what served their well-being? Sometimes accommodating their wishes, sometimes gently overriding them when confusion or fear was guiding their requests. The former friend, what served both their well-being and her own? Honest acknowledgement of what had happened, clear boundaries about what felt possible now, and genuine wishes for their healing, even if that healing happened separately from her. She could contextualize love across every relationship because she understood what love actually was at its core. She had the trunk, so she could grow any branch, generate any leaf that was needed in the moment. This is the gift of reflection. This is what the second stage of wisdom offers. When you understand essence, you're no longer trapped by circumstances. You're not helpless when you encounter a situation you haven't been specifically prepared for. You understand the principles at work, the fundamental dynamics, the core truth beneath the variations. And from that understanding, you can respond wisely to anything. This is why teachers often speak about the same topics repeatedly but from different angles. They're not just repeating themselves. They're helping you see the trunk from different perspectives, showing you how the same essence expresses through different branches, pointing at the core truth in multiple ways until you finally grasp it for yourself. But here's what's crucial to understand. Reflection, as powerful as it is, still isn't transformation. You can understand patience perfectly, grasp its essence completely, see how acceptance leads to peace in 100 different situations. But that understanding alone won't make you patient. You can comprehend love deeply, recognize its trunk clearly, know exactly how it should express in various contexts. But that knowledge won't necessarily make you loving. Because transformation doesn't happen through understanding alone. It happens through integration, through practice, through the third stage, meditation, which means returning again and again to the truth until it becomes part of your natural response rather than just something you know. Think of it this way. Listening gives you the map. Reflection helps you understand the map, see how different landmarks relate to each other, grasp the underlying geography. But meditation is actually walking the terrain, step by step, until the path becomes so familiar you could walk it in your sleep. You need all three stages. Skip listening, and you have nothing to work with. Skip reflection, and you're practicing by rote without understanding what you're actually doing or why. Skip meditation, and you've got beautiful understanding that never actually changes how you live. So reflect deeply on what you've heard. Look for the trunk beneath the branches, the essence beneath the expressions. Examine your own experience for patterns, for the core dynamics that create suffering, and the core dynamics that create freedom. Ask yourself, what do my peaceful moments share? What do my suffering moments share? What's the trunk that connects all the times I've acted with wisdom? What's the trunk that connects all the times I've acted from fear or grasping? This reflection will give you understanding. Real, deep, applicable understanding that you can carry into any situation. And once you have that understanding, once you've grasped the essence through genuine reflection, then comes the most important work. Then comes the practice of integration, of returning again and again to the truth until it becomes who you are. Then comes meditation. You've listened. You've reflected. Now comes the stage where transformation actually happens. Meditation. And before you start imagining something complicated, something requiring special cushions or perfect posture or hours of free time, let me tell you what meditation actually is. It's simpler than you think. Meditation is returning again and again to the truth. That's it. You've heard the teaching through listening. You've understood its essence through reflection. Now you practice coming back to that truth over and over until it becomes so familiar, so integrated, that it's no longer something you think about, it's something you are. This is where most people get confused about meditation. They think it's about the technique, about sitting a certain way, breathing a certain way, following specific steps in a specific order. And yes, techniques can be helpful. They give you a structure, a starting point, a method for training your attention. But the technique is just the vehicle. It's not the destination. The destination is the state itself, the peace that comes from acceptance, the compassion that arises when you see suffering clearly, the patience that emerges when you stop fighting what is, the love that flows when you're no longer trapped in separation. In the beginning, you need the technique to help you find that state. You follow the steps, use the words, practice the visualizations. These are like training wheels on a bicycle, necessary at first, helpful for learning. But eventually, the practice matures. You move beyond the technique to the state itself. You no longer need the elaborate scaffolding because you know how to access the truth directly. Think of it this way. When you're learning to cook a complex dish, you follow the recipe precisely. Exact measurements, specific timing, step-by-step instructions. But once you understand what you're actually doing, how the flavors work together, what each ingredient contributes, how heat transforms the elements, you can cook without the recipe. You understand the essence, and you can create from that understanding. Meditation works the same way. The technique gets you to the state, but the state is what transforms you. So what does this practice of returning look like in real life? Imagine you're in a Viking longship, rowing across the ocean. You're the captain, sitting in the back with the steering oar, trying to guide the ship toward a distant shore. But you're not alone in the boat. You have 11 rowers with you. And here's the problem. They've been rowing their whole lives toward different destinations. They have their own habits, their own preferred directions, their own ideas about where the ship should go. These 11 rowers are your habits, your conditioning, your automatic patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. For years, they've been rowing you toward reactivity, toward grasping, toward aversion, toward the same old suffering patterns you know so well. They're very good at it. They've practiced for a long time. Now you want to go in a different direction, toward peace, toward wisdom, toward freedom. But the rowers don't know how to row there yet. They keep automatically pulling toward the old familiar shores. This is what meditation trains. You're educating the rowers, teaching them a new direction, a new way of moving through the waters of your life. And how do you educate rowers? Not by yelling at them once and expecting them to change, not by explaining the theory of better rowing. You educate them through consistent practice, through returning again and again to the correct movement until it becomes their new habit. This is why meditation requires patience with your own growth. The rowers won't change direction overnight. They've been rowing the old way for decades. You have to patiently, consistently guide them toward the new direction. Every time you notice you've drifted into old patterns and you return to acceptance, you're training the rowers. Every time you catch yourself in resistance and you soften back into the present moment, you're educating your habits. Every time you choose patience over reactivity, peace over struggle, openness over defensiveness, you're teaching the crew a new way to row. At first, it takes enormous effort. You'll return to the truth, and moments later, the rowers have pulled you right back to the old patterns. So you return again, and again, and again. This is meditation. This constant returning. Not achieving some perfect state and staying there forever, but noticing when you've drifted and coming back. Noticing when you've forgotten and remembering. Noticing when the old patterns have taken over and gently, patiently redirecting toward the truth. A man started meditating with a very simple practice. Breathing. Just paying attention to the breath moving in and out. The instruction was basic. Notice the breath, and when your mind wanders, gently bring it back to the breath. Return to the breath, again and again. At first, it was incredibly frustrating. His mind would wander after 3 breaths. Sometimes after 1 breath, he'd bring it back, and it would wander again immediately. He wondered if he was doing it wrong. Surely meditation wasn't supposed to be this difficult, this choppy, this full of failure. But he kept practicing. Every morning, 20 minutes, noticing the breath and returning when his mind wandered, which was constantly, slowly, over months, something shifted. Not that his mind stopped wandering, it still did, but he got faster at noticing when it had wandered, faster at returning, and the returning itself became gentler, less frustrated, more accepting. Then one day at work, he found himself in a meeting that was going nowhere. People talking over each other, everyone frustrated, the energy tense and unproductive. He felt his own frustration rising, felt the familiar tension in his shoulders and jaw. And then, without planning it, without even thinking about it consciously, he took a breath. Just one conscious breath, noticing the inhale, the exhale. And in that moment, something shifted. The frustration was still there, but he wasn't caught in it. He could feel it without being controlled by it. He spoke from that calmer place, and his words shifted the energy in the room. Not dramatically, not magically, but enough. Later, he realized what had happened. The practice of returning to the breath on the cushion had trained something deeper than breathing technique. It had trained the capacity to return to the present moment, to step out of automatic reactivity, to find a pocket of space, even in the middle of chaos. He'd been training the 11 rowers, and they'd learned something. Not just how to pay attention to breath, but how to return to presence, to awareness, to the capacity to choose rather than just react. Over the years, this capacity grew. He'd notice himself getting pulled into worry about the future, and he'd return to now. He'd catch himself replaying an argument from the past, and he'd return to now. He'd feel himself contracting against a difficult emotion, and he'd return to the simple experience of what is. The breath practice had become a life practice. The meditation cushion had been the training ground, but the real practice was happening everywhere. In meetings, in traffic, in difficult conversations, in moments of joy and moments of pain. This is what meditation offers. Not an escape from life, but a training that makes you more present in life. More able to respond rather than react. More able to return to truth rather than get lost in habitual patterns. And here's the beautiful thing about this practice. Consistency matters more than intensity. It's better to practice returning for 10 minutes every day than for 2 hours once a month. Because you're training the rowers, and training happens through repetition, through consistent practice, through showing up again and again, even when it doesn't feel particularly profound. This is where most people quit. They practice intensely for a while, feel inspired, maybe even have some powerful experiences. Then life gets busy, the practice becomes routine, and they drift away. But the real transformation happens through steady, consistent practice. Through rowing in the new direction every single day, even when, especially when, it feels boring or pointless or like nothing is happening. Because something is happening. The rowers are learning. Your nervous system is being retrained. New neural pathways are being carved. The habit of returning is being strengthened with each return. You might not notice it day to day, but look back over months, over years, and you'll see the change. You'll see that you're less reactive, more patient, more able to stay present with difficulty. You'll see that the Viking ship is actually moving in a new direction, slowly but steadily, carried by rowers who have learned a new way to row. So meditate, but understand what you're actually doing. You're not trying to have special experiences, or achieve altered states, or become someone different. You're simply practicing return, coming back to the truth again and again, until that return becomes natural, effortless, automatic. And here's something you might not have realized. You're actually meditating right now, in a way. By listening to these teachings, by staying present with these words, by returning your attention when it wanders, you're practicing the art of return. You're training those 11 rowers, showing them a new direction. The practice isn't separate from your life. It is your life. Every moment, you choose presence over distraction, acceptance over resistance, wisdom over habit. That's meditation. The cushion is just where you train more formally, more deliberately. But the real practice happens in the traffic, in the difficult conversation, in the moment when plans fall apart, and you have to choose how to meet what is. So keep returning to the breath, to the teaching, to the truth, to the present moment. Return when you drift into worry. Return when you get lost in stories. Return when old patterns take over. Just return. Again and again. That's meditation. That's the practice. And that's what transforms everything. So you've been practicing for a while now. You've listened, reflected, meditated. You've learned about acceptance and patience and the art of returning. And at some point, you're going to wonder, am I actually making progress? This is a good question. Because spiritual practice without feedback, without some way to measure genuine growth, can become a kind of fantasy. You can tell yourself you're evolving while actually staying stuck in the same patterns dressed up in new spiritual language. So how do you know if you're really changing? How do you measure progress on a path that's supposed to transcend measurement? There are many metrics you could use. How peaceful you feel, how many hours you've meditated, how much you know about Buddhist philosophy, how many retreats you've attended. But according to ancient meditation manuals, particularly those studied throughout Tibet for centuries, there's one metric that's more reliable than all the others. The reduction of egocentrism. How obsessed are you with yourself? How much mental space does I, me, and mine occupy? How often are you the center of your own concern, the main character in every story, the person whose needs and feelings and perspectives matter most? This might sound harsh, but it's actually incredibly practical. Because you can measure this, you can pay attention to it, and you can watch it change over time as your practice deepens. Researchers actually studied this phenomenon in a fascinating way. They brought volunteers into a university lab and told them they were there for an experiment. The volunteers were asked to wait in a room while the researchers prepared everything. But the real experiment had already begun. Hidden cameras and microphones recorded these volunteers as they sat there making small talk with each other, chatting casually while they waited. Normal, everyday conversation. The researchers weren't listening to what the volunteers talked about. They were counting something specific: how many times each person used self-referential words. I, me, my, mine. Just in normal conversation about their day, their thoughts, their experiences, how often did each person reference themselves? Then the researchers followed up with these same people months and years later, tracking various aspects of their lives. Psychological health, relationship quality, career success, even physical well-being. The findings were striking. The people who used the most self-referential language in that brief waiting room conversation, the people who said I and me and mine most frequently, had significantly more problems down the line. More depression, more anxiety, more difficulty in relationships, more career challenges, even more physical health issues. Not because saying I causes these problems, but because frequent self-reference is a marker of something deeper: self-obsession. Being trapped in a very small world where everything revolves around your own needs, feelings, fears, and desires. And self-obsession, the Buddha taught, is the root of suffering. When your entire universe centers on yourself, everything becomes a threat or an opportunity in relation to you. Other people become objects that either help or hinder your agenda. Experiences become good or bad, based solely on whether they serve your preferences. Even spiritual practice becomes another way to improve yourself, to feel special, to be better than others. This is where it gets tricky, because once you start on a spiritual path, the ego doesn't disappear. It just moves into a smaller box. Before, you were living in the big box of regular life. Your ego could seek status and validation through money, appearance, career achievements, social standing. It had lots of room to operate, lots of ways to feel important. But then you decide to become spiritual, to work on yourself, to pursue something deeper. So the ego has to adapt. It moves into the smaller box of spiritual life and finds new ways to maintain its sense of specialness. Now it collects spiritual knowledge like trophies. It takes pride in how many retreats you've attended, how many hours you've meditated, how much you understand about Buddhist philosophy. It compares your practice to others' practices and finds subtle ways to feel superior. Or it becomes invested in being seen as humble, as selfless, as enlightened, which is just another form of seeking specialness, another way the ego tries to be important. This is what the teachings call the ego dressed in spiritual clothes. And it's more dangerous than the ordinary ego because it's harder to see, easier to rationalize, more subtle in its operations. A woman had been practicing meditation for years. She attended retreats regularly, read extensively about Dharma, and considered herself quite advanced on the spiritual path. She'd even started teaching occasionally, sharing what she'd learned with others. One evening, she was at a dinner party where the conversation turned to meditation and mindfulness. Someone mentioned an approach she wasn't familiar with, something from a different tradition. She felt something tighten in her chest, a subtle defensiveness, and before she could stop herself, she was explaining why that approach wasn't quite right, why the way she'd been taught was more authentic, more effective. The other person disagreed gently, sharing their own experience with the practice. And she found herself arguing more forcefully, bringing up texts and teachers, building a case for why her understanding was correct. Later that night, alone with her thoughts, she felt uncomfortable about the interaction. Something had happened there that didn't align with who she thought she'd become through years of practice. She sat with that discomfort and looked at it honestly. What had actually been happening in that conversation? The truth was hard to admit. She'd needed to be right, needed to establish her expertise, protect her identity as someone who understood these things deeply. The ego dressed in spiritual clothes had been running the show, using spiritual knowledge as just another way to feel superior, to be special. This was a turning point for her. Not because she suddenly became egoless, that's not how it works, but because she saw the pattern clearly and could no longer pretend it wasn't there. From that point forward, she started watching for it. The subtle ways ego crept into her practice, the slight feeling of superiority when she saw someone who meditated less seriously than her, the disappointment when a teaching she offered didn't get the response she hoped for, the pleasure when someone praised her understanding. Not to judge these things, but just to see them, to recognize that the work was deeper and more subtle than she'd imagined. So how do you check yourself? How do you see past the ego's disguises to measure real progress? Here are some questions worth sitting with. First, how do you treat people who can't do anything for you? The waiter at the restaurant, the cashier at the store, the person cleaning the office building, the stranger asking for directions. Do you treat them with the same respect and kindness you'd show someone who could advance your career or enhance your status? This test is revealing because there's no strategic benefit to being kind to these people. So how you treat them shows who you are when you're not performing, when there's no one to impress, when you're just being yourself. Second, how often do you think about yourself? Not as a judgment, but as honest observation. When you're in conversation, how much of your attention is on your own thoughts and reactions versus genuinely being present with the other person? When you read news or hear about events, how quickly does your mind jump to, how does this affect me? Third, can you be genuinely happy when good things happen to others? Especially when those good things are things you wanted for yourself. Can you celebrate someone else's success without comparing it to your own situation, without feeling diminished by their gain? These questions aren't meant to make you feel bad about yourself. They're meant to show you where you actually are, which is the only place from which you can genuinely grow. And here's what you might discover as practice deepens. Taking up less space is actually liberating. When you're not constantly concerned with yourself, with protecting your image and managing others' perceptions and ensuring your needs are met and your feelings are validated, an enormous amount of energy becomes available. You can actually listen to people instead of waiting for your turn to talk. You can be present with life as it unfolds instead of constantly filtering everything through, is this good for me? You can act from genuine care instead of calculated self-interest. The world becomes bigger, more spacious, more interesting when you're not trapped in the small prison of self-concern. This doesn't mean you don't take care of yourself or advocate for your needs. It means you're no longer obsessed with yourself. You're one person among billions, all trying to navigate this difficult, beautiful experience of being alive. And from that perspective, the question, how am I doing, becomes less urgent. Not because you don't care about growth, but because you're less interested in spiritual achievement as another form of self-enhancement. You're just practicing, returning to truth again and again, noticing when ego takes over and gently coming back to something bigger than self-concern. And that practice, that simple returning, gradually loosens ego's grip. Not through force, not through self-judgment, but through patient redirection of attention, away from the constant preoccupation with me toward the simple reality of what is. So measure your progress, not by how good you feel, or how much you know, or how spiritual you appear, but by how much space ego takes up in your life. Are you less defensive than you used to be? Less need to be right? Less concerned with others' opinions of you? More able to be genuinely happy for others? More interested in understanding than in being understood? These are the markers of real progress. Not dramatic, not glamorous, but genuine. The slow, steady reduction of the prison of self-concern and the gradual opening into something more spacious, more connected, more free. So, tomorrow morning comes. the alarm goes off, and you're back in your life with all its chaos and demands and unexpected complications. And at some point during the day, probably sooner than you'd like, life isn't going to go your way. The question is, what will you do in that moment? Because this is where everything we've explored together either becomes real or remains just beautiful ideas. In that moment when the plan falls apart, when someone frustrates you, when your body won't cooperate, when reality once again refuses to match your preferences. In that moment, you'll have a choice. And the first thing to understand is that you won't remember any of this perfectly. You'll forget. You'll react. You'll fall back into old patterns. That's normal. That's human. That's part of the process. But gradually, with practice, there will be a pause. Just a tiny pause between what happens and how you respond. And in that pause lives all your freedom. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you feel the anger rise. But before you honk, before you curse, before you let that anger take over your next 15 minutes, there's a pause. Just a moment where you can ask yourself a simple question. Am I accepting what is, or am I fighting it? That's the question. Not complicated, not requiring years of philosophical training. Just, am I meeting this moment as it is, or am I demanding it be different before I'll allow myself peace? In the traffic, the answer becomes clear immediately. You're fighting. You're arguing with the reality that someone just cut you off. And that fighting is creating suffering that has nothing to do with the actual traffic. So you soften. You take a breath. You say to yourself, or to the universe, or to no one in particular, this is what's happening right now. Not, this shouldn't be happening. Just, this is what is. And in that acceptance, something shifts. Not the traffic, not the other driver, but the suffering you were creating by fighting what couldn't be changed. This is the practice. Moment by moment, choice by choice, returning to acceptance instead of remaining trapped in resistance. And you can experiment with this in small ways throughout your day. Little laboratories for learning. When you're waiting in line and it's moving slowly, instead of letting impatience build, experiment with acceptance. This is the speed the line is moving. This is what's happening right now. Notice what shifts in your body when you stop fighting. When someone doesn't understand what you're trying to say, and you have to explain again, instead of getting frustrated, experiment with patience. See the suffering in them, the difficulty they're having, rather than making it about your annoyance. When your meditation feels boring, or your practice feels dry, instead of quitting, experiment with showing up anyway. Training the capacity for consistency over the need for constant inspiration. Small experiments, small moments of choosing differently. This is how transformation actually happens, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in the accumulation of small choices made again and again. Here are 3 practices you can start with, 3 simple things to experiment with daily. First, notice your expectations. Not to judge them or get rid of them, just to see them. As you move through your day, catch yourself expecting things to go a certain way, expecting people to behave a certain way, expecting your body to feel a certain way, expecting events to unfold according to your plan. Just notice, oh, I'm expecting this meeting to be quick. I'm expecting them to agree with me. I'm expecting to feel good after this workout. Noticing expectations doesn't mean releasing them. It just means seeing them clearly, so that when they're not met, you recognize what's happening. You're not experiencing disappointment with reality. You're experiencing the gap between your expectation and reality. Second, practice accepting one small thing each day. Just one thing that isn't going your way. The weather, the traffic, someone's mood, your energy level, the pace of your progress on a project. Pick something small and practice the movement from resistance to acceptance. Notice the resistance, feel it in your body, and then consciously soften into, this is what's happening right now. Don't try to accept everything at once, just one small thing. Build the muscle of acceptance through daily practice with manageable challenges. Third, check your self-reference count. Pay attention to how often you're thinking about yourself, talking about yourself, concerned with how things affect you. Not to judge it, but to see it. Because you can't change what you don't see. And the more you see ego operating, the less power it has to run your life unconsciously. These 3 practices, noticing expectations, accepting one thing, watching self-reference, they're simple but powerful. Do them daily, and you'll find yourself changing in ways that feel almost imperceptible until you look back over months and realize you're responding to life completely differently than you used to. And when you forget, when you fall back into old patterns, when you realize you've spent a whole day trapped in resistance and self-concern, you'll know what to do. Return. Return to these teachings. Return to the breath. Return to the present moment. Return to acceptance. That's all meditation is, the practice of return. And you can do it anytime, anywhere, in any circumstance. Progress isn't measured in days where you did everything perfectly. It's measured in moments. Moments when you chose differently, when you paused instead of reacted, when you accepted instead of fought, when you softened instead of hardened. One moment at a time. That's how the Viking ship changes direction. That's how the 11 rowers learn to row toward freedom instead of suffering. There was someone sitting in traffic one evening, stuck behind a freight train that seemed to stretch to infinity. This person had been practicing these teachings for a while, not perfectly, but consistently. The old pattern would have been frustration, tightness, maybe honking the horn just to release some of the tension. But in that moment, there was a pause, a tiny space before the reaction. And in that space, a question: am I accepting or fighting? Fighting was so familiar, so well practiced. But fighting was also what created the suffering. The train didn't care about the honking. The train was just being a train. So this person tried something different. Took hands off the wheel, took a breath, and said quietly, "This is what's happening right now." And something shifted. Not the traffic, not the circumstances, but the internal experience of those circumstances. The tightness eased, the shoulders dropped, and there, in the middle of being stuck, peace became possible. Not the peace of everything going right, the peace of finally stopping the fight with what is. This is what's available to you. Not someday when you're more advanced or more enlightened or more practiced. Right now, in whatever difficult moment you're facing or will face tomorrow. Peace is always accessible. Not because circumstances become perfect, but because you stop requiring perfection as the price of your peace. The Buddha taught something beautiful about this. He said that suffering ceases when craving ceases. When you stop demanding that this moment be different, when you stop grasping for what isn't here, or pushing away what is, suffering ends. Not pain. Pain is part of life, but the suffering we create by fighting pain, that ends. The suffering we create by resisting reality, that ends. And what remains is simply what is. Life as it actually is, meeting you where you actually are. In this moment, that's the only moment you ever really have. You've taken a journey tonight, listening to these teachings. 3 hours of exploring what it means to find peace when life doesn't go your way. And wherever you are right now, lying in bed in Singapore as the sun rises, sitting at your desk in London during a lunch break, driving through the night in California, cooking dinner in Sao Paulo, you're part of a global community, all searching for the same thing. Freedom from unnecessary suffering, peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, the ability to meet life as it is, rather than how we wish it would be. If something shifted for you during this time together, if something landed, or opened, or became clearer, carry that with you. Let it inform how you meet tomorrow. And when tomorrow comes with its inevitable challenges, its plans that fall apart, its moments that don't match your expectations, you'll know what to do. Pause. Ask yourself, am I accepting or fighting? And then, gently, patiently, choose acceptance. Choose peace. Choose to stop fighting the freight train. This is the practice. This is the path. This is how suffering ends and freedom begins. Rest now if you need to. Let these teachings integrate while you sleep or move through your day. And know that you can return to them anytime. They're not going anywhere. When life doesn't go your way tomorrow, you'll know what to do. You'll know how to find peace in the chaos.